everyone, welcome. We are going to continue our conversation on understanding by design. And now that we've sort of taken a look at what the model is, what the different elements of it are, we have an expert on the topic over here with us today, Beth Holland. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, Beth.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and so just go ahead and maybe just introduce yourself to our faculty.
Sure. So, hi everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name's Beth Holland, and I actually work a lot with Sabba at EdTechTeacher. And so in that capacity, I'm an instructor. I work with schools and districts and some higher ed groups at schools across the country and abroad. And before that, I was the director of technology at a really small preschool through 8th grade school in Newport, Rhode Island. And Sabba and I have talked a lot about backwards design because that was really the model that I used a lot when providing professional development to my faculty, where it was a great way for us to focus on, what's really important to our students as learners. And how can we use this idea of setting really clear learning objectives as a way to help with lesson plan and curriculum development. So that's where, a little bit about where I'm coming from with this, and I was really excited to be invited by Sabba.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we're really excited to have you here. And one of the reasons I, asked you to join was because some of the great conversations that we've had and really just sort of some of the great presentations I've seen you do. And so one of the things that sort of evolved from a lot of these conversations is, a lot of people as they're using technology and, really sort of dealing with the different types of information and just the amount of information that's out there, we have a lot more flexibility in how we design lessons. And I think a lot of people, we keep bringing it back to this understanding by design model. So maybe just, could you share a little bit about the value you believe understanding by design brings when you're planning instruction?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's really important with understanding by design, and especially when technology comes into play, is too often with technology, it starts out with this I've got to do a technology project. Or when I was working with teachers, that I would get a lot of, we want to do a PowerPoint project. It's like, do you really want to do a PowerPoint project, or do you want your students to give an oral presentation about what they learned from a unit of study? And just, words matter. And so in just the way that I could work with teachers on how they were able to start phrasing things, we could come up with, much more effective ways to even envision how the tools might come in. And in working with, schools and working with teachers right now, a lot of times there's a bit of a hesitation, sometimes a trepidation around, I've got my curriculum, I have all of these lesson plans, I have everything that I need to actually cover, and how am I going to fit this technology in? And instead of starting with, how do we fit this technology in, to say, well, what is it we really want our students to do? What do we want them to learn? What do we want them to communicate? What do we want learning to look like? Because if we haven't defined what we want learning to look like, how do we know if we've learned anything? And that has absolutely nothing to do with technology or devices. I mean, we never start and say, I've got this pencil, and what am I going to do with it? We don't start with a pencil. We start with the need to communicate on paper. And then we see a pencil as this mistake-tolerant tool to help us achieve that objective. So, that's where it comes from a lot of times when thinking about how do we bring this methodology and this framework in. Just to give a little bit of a visual, I really started to think about this a lot years ago. I worked with a elementary school teacher who was starting with iPads, and she says, I'm really frustrated with this iPad because the iPad can't do virtual field trips. And I thought about it for a minute. I said, well, what do you mean the iPads can't do virtual field trips? And she says, there's no app for this. I can't find a way for my iPad to do a virtual field trip. And when we really started talking and I listened to what she was saying, what she really wanted was for her students to be able to explore the ecosystems and biomes around the world and make the connections between the geography, the latitude, longitude, the ecosystems, the biomes, and then what types of habitats showed up, and then what types of organisms existed, and down the rabbit hole from there, where she had an amazing inquiry-based project in mind. And instead of starting with, I want my students to really make sense of the role of biodiversity in the planet and how that could trickle down, instead it was, what do I do with this iPad? And I think that's why, backwards design and understanding by design, comes into play so much.
I really, really, really like what you said about the idea of words matter. And I think, especially when we're working with our higher education students, they're used to hearing the word PowerPoint, PowerPoint, PowerPoint over and over. And I think it has a sort of very negative connotation that kind of comes along with it now. And so I think if you're going to try to bring in, that level of excitement, that level of engagement, and you really want them to start thinking critically about what it is they're going to be doing in the classroom, then you're absolutely right. The words that we use and choose really matter. And so I think that kind of leads us into the next thing. One of the things I love about understanding by design is that it makes you really look at the big picture. If you could pick one thing that you wanted your students to leave with, what would that be? And I think, a lot of times teachers really sort of start in different places when they're beginning to plan instruction. Some, it's easier for them to start with a big picture view, and others, they like to start, with the syllabus, chapter 1, chapter 2, and kind of build from there. Can you talk a little bit about is there a right way or a wrong way, and what the sort of how would you begin? What advice would you give people? We've got, we're one-to-one with iPads, you've got MacBooks as well. What advice might you give for people? This is the way you could begin.
So I think a lot of times we do actually start with the small, but what's important is we can start there, but that's not where we should end. So I'm just going to share my screen for a moment because I think I have an illustration that might help us as we're thinking through this. So I think I can't take credit for using this analogy. This one came from Sean McCusker, who's a great teacher up in Chicago. And so one of the things, we were talking about backwards design, and we were talking about, well, how do we really explain it? And he said, well, I really love to use that painting about the garden from Seurat. And he said, we started talking, he said, imagine if we sat down with Seurat and we said, how did you start with this painting? He probably said, well, I had this vision in mind. I wanted to tell this story. I wanted to paint this really big picture. I have a vision. And, I think ultimately we all have this vision of this is what we want learning to look like. And this is where we want our students to ultimately be by the time they finish our course or a year or, an entire degree. We have that really big vision. And then, once we've determined that really big vision, then we can move into stage 2. And when we think about stage 2 with backwards design, this is where we're really identifying the learning targets. What are the tasks that we really want our students to do? And this is kind of about the picture where Seurat probably said, oh, I want to make sure that I have a really good use of shadows. And I want to make sure that I've got this great reflection going in the water and that I haven't missed that. And I want to be able to use light and dark. And he started to really think about this process of painting his really big picture. It's only at this third stage that he says, okay, how am I actually going to make these dots? And one of the challenges is it's not that we need to necessarily, we have to start in one place or the other, but we don't have a really effective lesson until we've addressed all 3 stages. So a lot of times when working with different teachers, what we hear a lot of the time is, I've got to use this app. Or as Sabba said, we're going to do this PowerPoint presentation. Well, that's a dot. We start by focusing on the dot. And one technique that Greg Kulowick at EdTechTeacher and I have been using a lot lately actually comes from Six Sigma, which is a group that engineers use, and it has to do with coming up with manufacturing process. And so they use this technique called the 5 whys. So anytime you're going to make a statement I want my students to make a PowerPoint, you're going to ask why 5 times. So if I was to look at that 7th grade history teacher I was working with who said, well, my students are going to make PowerPoint presentations about World War I, I'd say, okay, why? And he'd say, well, I want them to be able to communicate their research to the rest of the class after they're finished with researching this topic. And I'd say, okay, why? And he'd say, well, I want to make sure that they understand all the different causes and effects that led to the upstart of World War I so that they can ultimately start to make those connections when World War II rolls around, when we get to that in a few weeks. And you could say, okay, why? And then he'll dig in, well, I want them to make sure that they know how to use evidence from primary source materials to back up their opinions when they're starting to make a fact, or starting to make a statement or an argument. Well, when you get to that point, that was only 4 whys, but I did this with them a few times. Then you know what the real learning looks like. And if the real objective is for students to use primary source artifacts to back up an argument while they're making a connection to a specific event in history, what does that have to do with a PowerPoint? Like, maybe a PowerPoint presentation comes out of that, but the focus is on the learning. So if it is something where you're starting with the dot, in the public schools, a lot of the dots are the state standards. I worked with a teacher the other day, and the Massachusetts state standard said that students had to be able to compare and contrast a pie chart, a scatter plot, and a bar graph. And that was a dot, and that's great. But now, why do we have to know that? And when we think about it bigger, it's because they need to be able to understand the visualization of data. And when that's the objective, and we spin around and start working backwards again, it's not a worksheet that necessarily has to be that demonstration of learning. So I think it's really important that even if we do start small and go big, or if we go big and start small, our lesson planning isn't complete until we've made sure to address all three stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, what I really like a lot about what you said is, when you have sort of that big vision or that big picture in mind, you kind of know where you're headed. You know what your ultimate goal is. And so if something, you take a wrong turn along the way, you know how to perhaps, navigate and find another route that's going to allow you to go that way. Or perhaps you've got one student that wants to go one direction and another that wants to go another direction. And you can kind of make those accommodations, I think. And that's sort of one of the things I think that technology really sort of allows to become an easier process. It was difficult, I think, before to be able to give students that much flexibility to do these, different directions. But now it sort of seems a lot more of a seamless process. So one of the other things you touched on was tasks, right? The different tasks that students can do. And I think, really at the heart of the Understanding by Design model is, the formative assessment process, right? With the summative sort of really at the end. So with devices now that we have iPads and MacBooks and whatnot, what are some of the different ways that you see people being able to change the way they assess their students from perhaps that, traditional, multiple choice exam to what are some of the other ways that they can kind of use technology now to have students demonstrate their understanding?
So two different things are coming to mind right now when we think about task and thinking about assessment. And the first one is, given the fact that everything is networked, we have, whether it's iCloud or Google Docs or OneDrive or whatever it is that you choose, I think what's really exciting is that as teachers, we can actually watch all of the process unfold. And it's not that we're just assessing a product that gets turned in at the end, but we're seeing the process all along. So as you mentioned, formative assessment, how can we take, have different checkpoints along the way? Whenever I was working with students on a longer projects like the World War I PowerPoints, the idea was in the end, they had that presentation, but we had checked in so many times along the way with their research, with their, we made them storyboard it so we could explain how did their visuals support their text. We had practiced with them. They had turned in audio recordings of their practice. So before they ever got to that final phase where it was one of the tasks that the teacher wanted them to do was to be able to stand up in front of a group and communicate, which was a really important objective. By the time they got there, the teacher already knew roughly where were they going to be. And so Todd Curtis, who is a teacher in Massachusetts, called it ubiquitous opportunity. Like, we don't have to wait till the end to find out where they are. The second piece that I'm thinking about is Rashawn Richards, who created the Explain Everything app, has created, I find it fun to say, but he created a model, he's calling it QFAT, for Qualitative Formative Assessment Toolkit. And one of the things that we now have available is that not only is it possible to get like that multiple choice, but when we have these devices, we could very quickly create an illustration or create a quick audio recording or create a quick screencast where we're actually able to explain our thinking. And because it can happen in these really small snippets and it can happen quickly, we're not limited to multiple choice. And if we look at the history of something like multiple choice, I mean, that was a byproduct of the industrial era where we needed just a really fast way to do assessment. But now with all these devices, we can get really meaningful and really quality assessment information just as quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And just in speaking about, Rashawn Richards, explain everything, obviously automatically comes to mind. And just really seeing the ability to students, screencast and sort of work through and just being able to really hear their thinking in that process. You're absolutely right. Really sort of gives you a much deeper lens into, their progress, where they need help, and just sort of really the conversations that emerge from them engaging in those experiences.
And I mean, I think as well with that, it raises the question of what are we really assessing? Are we assessing their ability to fill in a bubble, or are we assessing their ability to make an explanation? And that's where, again, the technology becomes so exciting, because we've got these multiple pathways to learning. And if our goal, and this is back to backwards design, if our goal and our objective is really clearly articulated, then why does it matter how we get there? And some students might be able to get there through audio, and some might get there through writing, and some might get there through creating an infographic. And if they're able to demonstrate their understanding of that objective, and they can demonstrate, the competency that they need and you want, it doesn't really matter how it is they got there, as long as you can prove that they're actually there.
Absolutely. And I think, and again, it sort of goes back to, that's why I love this model, that, it really forces you to ask yourself every step of the way, why am I doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Because you've got that big picture in mind. And so, does filling a bubble help your student leave your class doing what it is you wanted them to do? Or is it perhaps something else that you need to perhaps, take a look at, or maybe engage them in?
Right. And it's not to say that, the bubble doesn't help sometimes. I mean, there may be, there's some great student response systems where, maybe what you need to know is, like, at this precise moment, do they have mastery of this set of vocabulary terms? And either they know it or they don't. That's an opportunity where you could use something to push it out really quickly and know exactly where your group is. I think with all of it, it's knowing that it's always an and versus an or. Like, there's always another way that you have an opportunity to assess learning.
So I really loved what you said about the importance of those traditional assessments, because, again, when you go back to this model, it's really hard to take people to the big picture and to get them, critically thinking and analyzing and comparing and contrasting if they don't have those basics down. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times, we don't give as much value to sometimes just some of the simple tasks that are necessary to assess learning. And so it kind of takes us into sort of that next model that we wanted to take a look at, which is the SAMR model, where a lot of times people are like, oh no, substitution is wrong, and we have to be at redefinition. But really, I really feel like SAMR and UBD really sort of go hand in hand in really helping you. Yes, there's a big picture, but we have to start with the small steps first and sort of build our way up, to what it is that we have in mind. So can you talk a little bit about the SAMR model and the role it plays when designing instruction?
Okay, so again, coming back to the idea that we've got these multiple pathways to learning, where, the idea is that if we're all trying to, like, get to the lighthouse, it doesn't necessarily matter which pathway we take, as long as we're all able to get there, and not even necessarily roughly at the same time. As long as we actually get there, that's what's important. So with that, I had mentioned, like, the idea that we have these objectives and there's lots of tasks that are leading into it. And when we think about the tasks, some of them might be more traditional tasks, like a quick actual multiple choice assessment. Some of them may be larger tasks or ones that take advantage of various tools. But the idea, if we come back to this backwards design, is we've got this learning objective, and there's multiple tasks that the students will complete on their pathway towards achieving that objective. And as Sabba said, when we think about it through the lens of the SAMR model, that's going to allow us to really take a look at the different tasks. So this is actually a redrawn version of the SAMR model from Dr. Puntadora, and I modified it a little bit, because what I find a lot of times it becomes a question of, like, what are we actually redefining? And at the heart of the model, and we had the privilege of listening to him speak at one of the iPad summits a couple years ago, he just kept talking about the task. And he also talked about the fact that the different levels of the model don't necessarily refer to the product, but they have to do with the process. So it's really asking this question, like, what are we redefining? And we're redefining the tasks. And remember that to achieve every objective, there's multiple tasks. So it might be at some point we do a substitution task. We say, okay, I could give a multiple choice assessment to determine whether or not they have mastery of the vocabulary, or I could use something like Socrative, where I have instant feedback as a teacher and it's instantly graded and I know exactly where my students are. Now, when that's one task leading towards an objective, there's no harm in that. I think that's a very valid task to complete, and it's a good use of the technology. It's not that everything has to be redefined. It's that there's the occasional times when you say, wow, thanks to the technology I have available, here's a new task I could now embark on. There's a teacher in Florida, he actually works with a group of 5th graders, and every year his 5th graders do a project in astronomy, and they each research a planet, and they learn they look up facts, and they take notes, and then ultimately, for a long time, they would then handwrite a paragraph about their planet, and it would go up on like a bulletin board, and that was essentially it. Well, when they started to get devices, they started and they said, okay, well, we're still gonna do all of these tasks. We're still gonna read, we're still gonna take notes, we're still going to write a paragraph, but we're gonna write that paragraph and type it. So same task, new technology. Nothing's really changed with that. Now, it was still a very good lesson and the students were still able to learn a lot about astronomy and planets. It's just that we hadn't really changed the task. So now let's look at this idea of augmentation. Now, we're not going to change the task, but we're going to add a functional improvement. So again, with this task, we're researching our planets, we're writing this paragraph, but this time they started using Google Docs. And they started taking advantage of the fact that they could work digitally with their text. So while writing their paragraphs, they were able to share those paragraphs and they could get feedback from each other using the comments. And they could take advantage of some of the technology like speak selection. They could, as young students and young writers, suddenly they could hear their own writing played back to them. So the task of writing this paragraph didn't change, but there was a major functional improvement thanks to the technology. And at this augmentation phase, it's like, okay, great, I'm really starting to take advantage of what the technology can do, and I can see where it has a role in the task that I'm trying to complete. But where it starts to get really exciting is where Nick, who's the teacher of this class, started to say, wait a second, I don't have to just have my students type a paragraph, because they had access to Macs and they had access to iPads. And he said, well, hang on a second. Instead of just having our students write a paragraph when they're done, what if they all collaborated to create a book about the solar system? And what if they were able to still do their research and still write their notes and still type up those facts, but what if we changed it so they also could create like a 3D model of their planet and take us on a little virtual tour? And they could also record an audio as if they were leaving a message having gone to visit their planet. And then what if we were able to put everything together so we have this big class solar system book, which the next group could then use as part of their research into the solar system. So at this point, because of the familiarity with the technology and because of that clearly identified objective of, we want our students to understand how all of the different planets and everything in the solar system work together, they could start to change the tasks. And when you start to change the tasks once, then you could start to get to that point of the re-envisioning of these new tasks. So when we get to this actual idea redefinition, that's when you start saying, wow, I have this technology available. I have this clearly defined learning objective. Now I want to make new tasks. So I had said to Nick, I said, well, what are you going to do next? Like, you're going to do the solar system again, because that's a major point of your social studies curriculum. Like, what's next? And he's like, I don't know. Now we can do, like green screen video on iPads. So maybe I'll have the students, instead of, they'll write their paragraph like a script, but then maybe we do like a green screen video where they take you on a video tour through their 3-dimensional model to like explain their whole planet. And think about what a 4th grader will walk away with that. The 4th grader will walk away and say, okay, here's my paragraph on Saturn. Or a 4th grader walks away and says, wow, remember that time we made those videos where I was able to like stand on Saturn's rings and talk about it? And so with these new tasks, it opens up this whole world of possibility. But again, tying it back to backwards design, all of the tasks are driving towards that objective. And there's certain tasks, the research is still happening the same way. The note-taking was still happening on paper. There's nothing wrong with that. It's how they start to come up with these new tasks in association with it. And I think that's how these two things start to fit together really nicely.
Yeah, I completely agree. I love the example that you gave, especially because, like you said, it really focuses on, what are students able to do? And you can see throughout the process, the teacher is constantly, asking himself, what can they do now? What can they do now? What can they do now? Because, as we get access to more tools and different things, the possibilities really, for what we can create and do kind of then, are expanded. So, I'm sure, it must be a little bit overwhelming for a teacher, who's just kind of hearing this for the first time. What advice might you give for teachers who are, just beginning to integrate technology, who are perhaps, thinking about using the UBD model for planning instruction? What advice might you share with them?
I would say, starting with UBD, I think is a great place because it begins with like, what do I actually want my students to do? And then, when you start to bring in the technology piece, there's, I like to say that if you find yourself really frustrated with technology, it's probably because there's a different tool that would work better. If you find yourself really frustrated trying to get like digital content out and you realize you could have just handed out a stack of papers and there was no functional benefit, and I'm using words carefully, no functional benefit to them having it digitally, then use the old technology. So I think it's about identifying the functional benefit at the beginning. Like augmentation is an awesome place to start. And I think until you really get a handle on, what are the functional capabilities I have, it's hard to think about, they say redefinition, and the technical definition they say is it's coming up with something that was previously inconceivable. Well, how are you supposed to come up with the inconceivable? So I would say start with a functional improvement and say, I have this really clearly defined learning objective. This is where I want my students to go. Here's how I know I can provide a functional benefit to my students. And I know that this is really the scariest, hardest part, but then take a step back and let your kids have, or I guess they're older, they're not kids, but your students have a choice. If they can prove that they're meeting the objective, then let them pick the path. So I think knowing those functional benefits and then starting to say, how can I give my students some choice in terms of how they're able to reach that objective? Because again, if you're not trying to, there may be times when you are assessing their writing skills or you are assessing their ability to take a test, and that may be part of your objective. But if it's not part of your objective, then why does that have to be your form of assessment?
Yeah, no, definitely. And what I think I really, sort of just immediately comes to mind, like listening to you and hearing you share some of these stories, is one of the big conversations we have is that, in a couple years, a lot of our incoming students, these are going to be their environments. Mm-hmm. They're used to doing these types of activities, used to, having choice and having different ways in which to demonstrate their understanding. And so one of the things we're sort of looking at is, how can we start incorporating these experiences, now, so that when those students do come in, it doesn't feel like a completely foreign, back in time kind of experience that, they're experiencing while going to school. So thank you so much for sharing all of these wonderful words of wisdom and pieces of advice. And, I think we'll have a great time, sort of delving into this and exploring the different ways in which we can begin using this model. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I think, one last place you may want to begin. I don't know, Sabba, if you've seen it. Michael Wesch, who's a professor at Kansas State, created this amazing video in I think it was 2007 or 2005. It was called A Vision of Students Today. And I think that might be a really interesting one to think about watching as a group, because he profiles these kids that are in his class. And the backstory on it is fascinating as well, where, it's a big giant lecture hall at Kansas State, and yet the kids are sitting there like, this is not my environment, this is not my reality. My learning happens across platforms and across devices, and you're asking me to sit here and watch one dude talk. And so it's a really interesting, perspective on it, especially when you think about when it was that he actually published that. So I'll leave you with that last resource, but thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, it's good. Probably.